My name is JD Durkin, and on the morning of 9/11, I was at my high school, my freshman year, my third day of classes, and we watched the World Trade Center towers burn with our own
Oh my
eyes
god.
on that Tuesday morning.
How close were you?
West Orange, New Jersey is about 10, maybe 12 miles west of the city. So from the third floor chemistry labs in our high school at the top of Northfield Avenue, we always had a skyline view. And I'll never forget that morning, nearly the whole student body, all the guys at the school being up there, watching it unfold. Most of the classrooms had these old TVs, but they didn't all work. They were for this kind of like special program we had to watch at lunch every day. So some of them got regular news, some of them didn't. I remember Coach Fell of the football team was my algebra teacher. He couldn't get the TVs to work. So he's like, all right, we're just going to have class. And we were all kind of sitting there like, what is happening? But I remember the other teachers that morning, yeah, put on the news. And then everyone was kind of out of there within a few hours. They canceled school for the day and they sent the buses home early so everyone could be with their families. Yeah, but obviously an incredibly chaotic day and several weeks.
Yeah, and so obviously, you come back to that later in your work, but from that point on, did you have any involvement in the community? Like, obviously, you're not cleaning up or doing anything like that, but what was your journey from that day to what you ended up doing?
Yeah, where I grew up was the sort of area where it was a big commuter zone. I'm born and raised in Essex County, New Jersey. So every house or every other house has a parent that was commuting to lower Manhattan at the time, including my mother, who used to work at 110 Wall. So my church, my school, my hometown of Caldwell, it just felt like everyone knew someone who, maybe wasn't able to get in touch with a family member, or you were hearing reports in the next few days of of some people you kind of knew from the community who had lost their lives or were first responders. And that included, I believe, 9 graduates from my high school, Seton Hall Prep. And yeah, a few years later, Matthew Salido was a graduate of SHP, and he lost his life that day. And I did work with the Salido family. I was a scholarship recipient in Matthew's honor for my senior year of high school. So of course, kind of just being so close to that area, it's a sort of thing that kind of impacts every community you're a part of. And it was very clear in my first 4 years there of high school, my 4 years at school, that it was going to be something a community I was a part of for sure.
Did that inform your decision to go into what you're doing now, or were there other aspects that came into play there?
No, I think the work as a journalist just sort of honestly, it kind of happened by accident. And then even my further involvement covering stories like the 9/11 VCF and the healthcare fight on Capitol Hill, it was never a story I really set out to cover. It's not why I moved to DC. It just sort of
Mhm.
happened. And I think there have been themes of 9/11, community members, people very close to me who lost parents that day. And it's a sort of thing that's just always kind of stayed active in my personal and professional life. And I viewed that, I said, there's a reason for that. And I will use whatever bits of talent I have, resources I have, the platform I have to share those stories. So it's never been a conscious effort, I think, but it's always been really important. Probably the most important set of stories I've ever worked on.
How did you first get involved?
I was working as a White House reporter starting February 2017. So that's the second month or so of the Trump administration. That's like the Sean Spicer
Yeah.
era. And I pretty quickly moved to Capitol Hill because I just liked the nature of the work on the Hill much better than the White House. And it was pretty quick after I was there where Jon Stewart was making a lot of trips to Capitol Hill. And that's where I got to know, people like John Feel and the Barish and McGarry law firm and people like Lila Nordstrom. It was just it was a sort of story that I felt such a gravitation towards. And it was easy for me to pitch my editor in chief to say, hey, even though I cover tech and business, this is really important. I knew the members of Congress who were associated with this because they tended to be New York
Mhm.
members and New Jersey members of Congress. So since that's where I'm from, those were the kind of members and their staffs I was closer with. And yeah, and I so quickly fell into the story and how difficult it was for these first responders. They made hundreds, as not exaggeration, as you know, hundreds of trips to Capitol Hill. And I felt it was such an important story. And there was a reason I was there at the right time to kind of cover it and be at all those press conferences.
Well, it's so interesting. I feel like everyone who I speak to on this podcast, the one thing that they all have in common is their love for the community and the people fighting for these things. And I was curious, like, what did you learn about these people who were going down there hundreds of times?
I learned that they knew they were on the right side of history. They knew their government had lied to them. They knew very early on what everyone else would eventually find to be the truth, which is that the air was not safe to breathe, the water was not safe to
Hmm.
drink, and that they were being impacted. Their colleagues, their schoolmates, their coworkers, other first responders were falling ill with conditions that they should not have had. And I also saw in their eyes the exhausted frustration of knocking on so many doors in the US Capitol,
Yeah.
just trying to get in touch with, just trying to get this done, which to them was just such a no brainer to be there now for the people who had been there for us in our darkest hour in our lives. And they're just incredibly inspiring people. And honestly, it's a sort of story as a journalist I don't mind admitting. Obviously, you're supposed to be objective as a reporter, but it was really tough for me.
Hmm.
I don't really know if I've admitted this, but it was not easy for me to sort of view this as objective. This wasn't objective to me.
Right.
Yeah, it was personal because it was 9/11 and I had that community angle with a lot of these guys who were from Jersey, they're from Staten Island, they're from Long Island, they're just like my families, right? And I knew the frustration specifically at the time with Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, blocking passage of this for a long time. And I really wanted these 9/11 advocates to win, even if that's not a position you really have as a journalist. I felt like this was important enough, and yeah, a lot of that probably informed the underlying aggressive nature with which I knew this was an important story I wanted to cover.
Yeah, and that brings me to my next thought is, in your work, how have you seen that media and like what you do can heal community?
I don't know about heal the community, but definitely push things forward. I mean, media pressure is the point.
Yeah.
Honestly, that's why Jon Stewart's involved. That's why Jon Stewart has had guys like John Field, um, Lou Alvarez on his show all those years ago. I think that's why Jon Stewart himself would be on Capitol Hill, because people knew that if Jon Stewart were there, media would pay attention, and they were right.
Right.
Um, and there's something to be said about pressure at even at press conferences. I remember there were concerns that Jon Stewart and John Field had about the lack of progress, and we would be able to use those opportunities at the press conferences, which would be attended by everyone, all the advocates who were down there, handful of members of Congress, maybe 8, 9, 10, 12 members were there. And with all the cameras on, that would be the opportunity to really ask some really pressing questions about it and help highlight that. So I think there's a role. I think it's admittedly a small role, but anything you could do to kind of help tell those stories at that time. And those guys understood it, right? So all the Johns, all the first responders, they made themselves available. Michael Barish made himself available to reporters to make sure that awareness was being raised, and hopefully they could get those bills done.
Yeah, and you touched on the challenge of staying objective in this particular situation. I was curious, like, how has working closely with the 9/11 community influenced your perspective on journalism?
Yeah, that's a great question. Especially during that time when I was in Washington, when Donald Trump was president, there was a lot of distractions. There's a lot of shiny things. And I understand why the media chases the shiny thing. I've done it and I get why. There is a reason as to why. But it allowed me to know when to step back and say, there are things that are more important. And like I can still kind of do the basics of my job while still putting a lot of emphasis on these things that might not be the splashy story. This was like the Russian collusion era of Trump politics, right? So that was like dominating the conversation. So it definitely made me a much better journalist, and it was inspiring to have other colleagues on the Hill as well who were sort of tended to be from the local tri-state media outlets also covering that story, because it was all the members of Congress that we covered, right? It was Senator Gillibrand, it was Chuck Schumer, it was Cory Booker, it was AOC, it was Pete King, it was Cory Gardner. These were members we were covering, and the Hakeem Jeffrieses of the world, and it was a part of our job as well. that this was a priority for them.
Was there like a most impactful moment covering these stories?
I think what my brain first goes to was seeing John Stewart walk out of a hallway with a pack of other first responders, and these guys were so exhausted. They were so physically tired, and they just met with McConnell. I think you and I have talked about this before. And I asked them, how confident are you can finally get this done? And they said, it's a done deal because we gave Mitch McConnell Lou Alvarez's badge. Now, Lou Alvarez, the NYPD, of course, had made many trips and had famously spoke in front of Congress. And the physical impacts of his deteriorating health were so evident and so heartbreaking over the years that he had been there. And when those guys came out and they said, we gave McConnell, this guy we've been fighting, we gave him Detective Alvarez's badge. So we know this is going to get done. That's the moment I'll never forget. I don't even know if people realize like that was such a big sort of final step to get this done. And that was right around the time Detective Alvarez lost his life. So yeah, that's the number one thing I think.
Wow, wow. And interesting. I was so thanking you for introducing me to Lila Nordstrom, but she came on the podcast, and she was amazing. And we were talking about these big events like 9/11 and COVID, obviously very different, but how we respond as a government to those things are kind of similar in this rush to normalcy. And in your work, have you found any like similarities to how we responded to 9/11 to other events as well?
Yeah, I've been really impressed and inspired, I think, by the community for keeping up the fight and raising that awareness on other things. Lila was very active during school closures with COVID, as you just mentioned. I remember her writing many years back after the BP oil spill and basically saying, hey, there's so many learned lessons that we basically had. Obviously, they're not comparable tragedies in a lot of ways, but maybe there are under the surface for the human, personal, or the children element, how children will be impacted or school kids will be impacted. And then how a lot of the first responders very quickly took their fight to burn pit legislation.
Mm-hmm.
After they finally got the VCF over the finish line, which took years and years of work, they said, great, we've got the next fight. These are the same toxins, the same chemicals. Our veterans are coming back from war. We're now continuing the work. We've got all the relationships, the resources here on Capitol Hill. Let's now get burn pit legislation done. And the Feel Good Foundation, the Jon Stewarts of the world were back there just as quickly to now work on the next thing. So those are things, honestly, that I've been made aware to because of the members of this community, because they are the ones who recognize the connections. I won't always recognize it because I'm not as intimately connected to it as they are, but they may say, like a Lila may say, hey, pay attention to this other thing. This has shades of something we've been through before. And that kind of then informs interviews I've done with people like Lila or Jon Stewart on the burn pits or on the impact of COVID.
I'm curious, like, how do you mentally, emotionally, and like physically prepare to cover these types of topics? Because obviously, like your job is to stay objective, but you're also human. So it's like, how do you? Do you have a routine? Do you meditate? Like, how do you go into these? Yeah.
I've been telling my therapist for years I'll give meditation more of a shot, Christine. I still haven't like quite gotten to it, but yes, I got my ways to manage inherent anxieties, and that's definitely a part of being a reporter, especially in a breaking newsroom, especially when you're on the TV side.
Yeah.
It's a lot of pressure and things change quickly, and so you have to be sharp. So it's just it's all about preparation. That's really what it is. In the case of the story we're talking about, if I knew there was a big press conference the next day, if John Field would text and say, hey, we're coming down Friday, that's like a day for me to spend the night before knowing the most updated bits of information. Where is a bill stuck? What offices are they visiting? Who are the staff members of those senators that they're visiting with? And then having my questions ready to go for press conferences. And then working on questions. Hey, if I run into John Field in the hallway, what are the quick 2 or 3 questions I'd most want to ask him on the record?
Right.
Or the same for Jon Stewart or Kenny Specht or whoever it was that I might see on the Hill that day. And that's kind of continued for my work today down at the stock exchange, where I'm not doing 9/11 focused reporting too much. But as you know, even the New York Stock Exchange, here again in my career, I've been brought back to a community that was so intimately and uniquely impacted by 9/11. And I'm surrounded by brokers every day who lived through that day in Lower Manhattan, have their own remarkable stories that have come from that. So, yeah, that's kind of what the preparation looks like. And just a reminder again that I'm just kind of brought back to the community from time to time.
I was curious, on that line of preparing, what advice would you give young journalists who wish to cover similar impactful topics like this and obviously very sensitive stories?
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, you may be drawn to those stories like me because there's a personal connection.
Hmm.
It's just, I think about that image from just seeing it that morning a lot, and I think that was always a bit of a through line for me. So I'd say you may sort of have that. You may be drawn to a personal one because it's a oil spill in your hometown of Ohio, and you're like, that's these are my people. This is my family. This is my community. I want to stay focused on that. I'd say don't be afraid to know when those stories go up because you will be better positioned to um, maybe have a bit of impact journalism if it's something that means more to you or your family or community than you may think. And then if not, or even if you are, be appropriately skeptical. I think government is, when government works and government does what it's supposed to, especially for the most vulnerable, there's no more singular powerful force than the federal government. It is a thing of beauty. But man, when they get it wrong, they really get it wrong. And especially that rush to return to normalcy for a lot of these types of disasters. I'd encourage you to be appropriately skeptical, not conspiratorial, but know when the tough questions need to be asked and not when to take government officials necessarily on the face for the things they say. Um, yeah, and just be prepared.
Are there any like specific responsibilities you feel journalists need to have when reporting on stories that involve trauma and tragedy?
I think, like a lot of stories, empathy is really important. Yeah, just be willing to ask people their experience. And in the case of this story in particular, people were very willing to talk about not just what the fall of 2001 looked like, but the health conditions they've been facing ever since. And I think anytime you have a difficult conversation with people in journalism, it always requires a bit of humility as the reporter to take your hat off and say, in good faith, "Hey, I'm JD. Can I just ask you some questions? Can you just kind of tell me about your life or give me a better context on this type of thing?" I think that's the most important approach you could have, and then know when to, how to, if you can, sort of separate that. I mean, I've covered a fair bit of tragedy before I was in TV. I was an editorial, and I still think of the era of like the ISIS attacks and like different high profile things that I've covered, different shootings. And it's the thing of like, you remember how victims spell their names because you have to write it over and over and over again as a breaking news writer. That stuff stays with you. And that's the sort of stuff your brain has a way of like wandering back to, where I was that Friday night in the newsroom when this happened. And so any kind of that separation you could possibly have, where you are human, but you have to kind of know when to leave some of that work at work and not have it kind of go home with you.
Well, therapy probably helps.
Therapy definitely helps. There's no doubt. Big advocate of talk therapy, no doubt.
I was also curious, just personally, what was the most shocking thing you learned, whether it be in an interview or something that you were researching?
I think the conditions of cancers, melanomas, and the tragic list goes on for Stuyvesant high school students specifically is probably most impactful for me. What we call the survivor community, right? It's the first responder community and then the survivor community. Everyone who lived and worked in Lower Manhattan and was told everything's cool, go back to your day to day.
Which I feel like is less known. What I found is people don't really know how many people are affected.
Right, or necessarily have a sense on just how many businesses tried to reopen so quickly, or school in the case of Stuyvesant. And I think the reason that Lila's story has always resonated with me, and the reason that's my answer, is because I was in high school. Right, the only difference was my high school was 10 miles away. I wasn't down there, but it was still my freshman year of high school. So when I look at people like Lila and her classmates, knowing they're just about all my age, and to hear about the conditions they were developing in their 20s, that was among the most impactful, of course. What's most surprised you? Can I ask you a question? Not to be the journalist for a second, but
No, of course. It's so funny when we hopped on, I was like, he's such a journalist with his posture, the way he projects, it's like so perfect.
it's a
I'm
speak.
like,
Listen, I've got my earpiece, IFB, and everything. So yeah,
oh
I
my God,
definitely
that's
I tend to
amazing.
come correct. Yeah.
Uh, but yes, you can ask me a question. What was your question?
What's been most impactful for you that you've learned through all of your interviews, coming at it from where you are?
I think I think just talking with John Feel about like his process going down there and learning that some of the people who went down were so sickly ill in wheelchairs getting chemo, and they would walk the halls and like still not get anywhere for the longest time is like the most impactful thing I've learned. And it makes me super frustrated with the government because, like, as John Stewart said in his testimony, first responders responded in less than 5 seconds. It took them, what, 10 years to pass a bill? Like, we just have to be better. It's so frustrating to me that that was the reality.
Yeah, and I remember a part about that from my reporting. Kind of an interesting detail, but I think about it a lot. Is they had taken so many years to go down there with very little progress. And then there was a sort of renewed effort around 2017, 2018. And I remember someone telling me that they thought the reason was that, there's a lot of turnover, there's a lot of churn in congressional
Mm-hmm.
offices. So if you work for Senator so and so, you might only be there for 2 to 3 years before going to House Ways and Means Committee or bouncing around the Hill. And by 2018, there had just been all these kind of new staffers in the office, even if the member of Congress had been the same a decade later. And it was the fact that there was new people, younger people, for these first responders and community members, survivor community members to go speak to. They were sort of hearing about it for the first time with a bit of a fresh perspective. And that helped allow a bit of a renewed urgency into 2018. That's at least something I had heard someone say to me that I always thought was sort of interesting, just about the human psychology of like, why does it take so long versus like, how can we finally get it done now? A lot of it was just, they were just new people to hear, and they were convinced of the urgency.
That's so interesting because like that's like a macro level of changes. But then when you think, like, I was talking to Lila and her like micro learnings of like how should she dress like as a survivor, and a lot of times people thought that her dad was a first responder, but that wasn't the case. And so how do you navigate these different conversations? And it's just it's so fascinating how much work goes into just being heard and then having someone do something about it.
I was really inspired too, because I remember a lot of those trips, and I think she writes about this in her book. A lot of her trips, she would be the only woman,
Mm-hmm.
or she would be one of two women. And that itself had its own challenges that she writes about in the book. I think to your point about presentation or, even safety, her mom would drop her off at the bus station in New York, and she'd be gone for 14 hours, whatever it is, and come back all that time later. Yeah, it's an amazing perspective that someone like Lila has.
And so right now you're at the stock exchange. So I'd love to hear, like, what are you doing now? Do you still do work with 9/11?
Yeah, I still mostly cover the stock market. I'm back covering the Fed, monetary policy, all that fun stuff. I think the most kind of 9/11 related work I'm doing these days kind of tends to be around the anniversary of some interviews. Obviously, that's a really important time at the stock exchange. And the stock exchange is the type of community that obviously takes the anniversary, takes the seriousness of it just to the highest degree, with the utmost respect and a lot of firsthand experience down there. Um, and then, honestly, something you and I have talked about, and I won't get into all the details because it's not my story to share, but, my best friend lost a direct family member. And so there are more personal ways, even all these years later, where those conversations still come up. And even if it's not publicly reporting, even if I'm not on air or writing something about it, that connection through him, in 9/11, and he did the reading of the names a couple of years ago, 2022. So I was down there on that rainy Sunday at Ground Zero. That feels, because he and I are so close, that feels like among the most important work that I still do, even if it's not even if my byline doesn't go on it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's the most meaningful stuff, is the stuff you don't say on camera.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess I would love to jump into kind of more uplifting questions now, if that's cool with you.
Of course.
So the first one is, what's the most beautiful thing you've learned doing this work?
That this persistent badass attitude will help you get the ugliest jobs done
Mm,
sometimes. Because there was a real kind of fierceness to a lot of these guys when they were down there. Tattoos out.
yeah.
They were disruptors. They were disruptors. They knew when to cause good trouble, as John Lewis used to say, in order to get this done. And there's an inspiring part to that for me, I think.
Yeah, John Field, he amazes me with everything he does. He's the funniest, but if he says something, you're scared sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for a lot of these members of Congress, they would say, man, I do not want to be on John Field's bad
Yeah.
side. I don't want John Field going out to the cameras, shit talking me,
Yeah, no.
right? That's the last thing we want.
He's like the sweetest
Yeah,
he's
I
like the
think
sweetest bear, but also like he can make shit happen.
absolutely. And what you see is what you get. And that's the wonderful part about him. And the work of the Feel Good Foundation is just incredible.
So, second question is, what is giving you the most energy right now?
It's a great question. What's giving me the most energy right now?
Yeah. Could be work, could be life, could be whatever it is.
Yeah, professionally for career, the election
Mhm.
timeline for sure. It's obviously really important. I'm covering the economic implications of the election closely, um, and then personally is just knowing when to not work. So I go hiking a lot, and I go visit my friends, and we go to music festivals. I go to a ton of concerts. That stuff brings me such joy and allows me to come back into work on Monday morning ready to go.
I love that. Last one is, what's something exciting you have planned for this year?
So it's the annual boys weekend in September. I gotta be honest, like I got cool trips, but that's the best. My best friends were in four different. We live in four different parts of the country, so we get together a couple times a year. September's the big one. Everyone comes to New York, Jersey, music festival in Asbury Park, time in LBI. It's like 4 or 5 days of live
Oh my
music.
god.
That's the
That's
best.
amazing. I'm
Yeah.
jealous.
We always say you got to have it on the calendar. And that
Yes.
helps you get through the doldrums of week to week and work. You're like, all right, but at least we got
Yep, you
this.
got
We're
something.
going to this thing. We got that show to look forward to,
Yep, exactly.
which is great. But I also do a lot of shows week to like. I got a great concert coming up this weekend. So those are little energizers in between.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to list your socials and anywhere that people can follow what you're doing now and what you have done down in the description of this episode. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been amazing and excited to keep watching what you're doing.
Thank you for telling the stories, Christina. Really important. You're linked up with the right people. And I think with each year that goes by, each anniversary that goes by, it's a new generation of New Yorkers, a new generation of Americans. And I think the stories associated with that day and the really just remarkable efforts of everyone in the years since, it's a story we need to tell the rest of our lives, and I hope we do.